Real-time Sovryn is go.
Ooh, the son of Satan here with you. I'm sorry, Dr. Brian Sovryn here with you. Jeez, let's get that straight. But anyway, here for another real-time Sovryn to talk some stuff up. Um, most people know about me that I do more than just dabble in the realm of AI, and particularly in the realm of generative AI. Um, and I there's varying ways that I like to test these AI. Like, how good is their knowledge base? How good is their database? How good are their responses? How good are their recoveries? That's a key one. And I ran across a thing recently where I was using Gemini Advanced, of course, from Google, and it gave me a very interesting result in what I was asking it. Now, for those that know me, and you can actually see it in the upper left, will that be the left? Your left, my left, of the screen when you're watching on YouTube. And by the way, folks, when you do watch on YouTube, like I do have things that are exclusive to the video. I know I get way more downloads on via audio, way more listens on audio through podcast apps. Whether you're listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Pocket Casts or whatever podcast app you happen to use. I know I get way more there, but trust me, on YouTube, most of the time I am putting in relevant exclusive things within the video itself, images and whatever else happens, to make sense. Anyway, to my left, maybe not your left, might be your right, depending upon the mirroring, is my Doctorate of Divinity. You can see it. It says Dr. Brian Sovryn right there as of 2015. And I do still very much do study in, scholarly study, more so than personal, in the realm of varying religions. And that does include Christianity. One of the interesting things that I ended up happening to ask Gemini, and I mean, an easy thing to ask, AI to test it, are to ask things that you're very, very certain about. And so I'm going to get to the question, I'm going to read it, and that's going to lead into our overall subject here for this real-time Sovryn. And I asked it the question, what Gnostic groups are mentioned in the New Testament? Now, before I get to its answer, admittedly, most people don't even know. Like, there's a lot of Christians today anyway now, ever since like Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Judas and maybe like Pistis Sophia, with Mary Magdalene and other texts. I think they have an idea, okay, that there was this, what is in their eyes, an abomination, a bastardization of Christianity known as Gnosticism. Okay. And they usually give it a very broad, painted with a very broad brush. But, they treat it like, this is the other part of what Christians think as far as Gnosticism goes, is they treat it as if that's a later invention. Okay. Just like they treat, Catholicism as some kind of later invention. And what they're always looking for, what a lot of Christians, especially Protestant denominations, which is basically anything other than Catholics, a lot of Protestant denominations are constantly looking for what they call this primitive Christianity, right? This Christianity that existed before, Constantine the Great, before the Council of Nicaea, maybe even something before the Ante-Nicene Fathers, right? The Church Fathers, something that thing that must have existed in the Apostolic Age. Now, when we're talking about the Apostolic Age, we're talking about, the time of the apostles, right? And the deacons, okay, which is basically the first century. All right, after the first century, that's when it's widely considered that most of the deacons had died, most of the, apostles, many of whom were disciples, and so on, that they had died off or were close to it, and that the second century, which is the years 100 CE and up, or 101 CE and up, I should say, that's when you end up with, you start to get like, the church fathers, like the Ante-Nicene fathers and so on. Okay. So a lot of these, Protestantism really very much, marketed itself in the idea that, it was going back to a pre-Catholic Christianity. Okay. That somehow in the first century, in the apostolic age, there was this singular Christianity that existed. Now, to caveat this, most Christians, otherwise they're denying the New Testament, they recognize that in the book of Acts, which is the first book after the four Gospels, that in the book of Acts, that, there's an apostolic council that occurs, and there's arguments between Peter and Paul and, and all of this over how things should be, but that basically everything got worked out, and, okay, sure, there was these little disagreements, but everybody worked everything out, and, we ended up with there was still that primitive Christianity, there was still that one Christianity that at least existed until the time of the book of Revelation. Now, that's an important thing, and we're going to actually talk about the book of Revelation here for a few minutes as well. The book of Revelation was, depending upon who you ask, was penned around 92 CE. Okay, so it's in the apostolic age, and usually it's considered to be penned by an apostle himself, that being John the Apostle, who is also credited with writing the Gospel of John. Now, there's people who debate that maybe, in fact, there are church fathers, early church fathers, who don't think that John the Apostle actually wrote the book of Revelation. And a lot of people also don't realize that there is extensive early Christian texts. And when I say early, I don't mean the apostolic age, because it can't be, because the damn thing was written at the end of the apostolic age. So obviously I don't mean that, but just in case you're particularly dense, I'm here to help you. But even in the second century, there were debates, and certainly in the third, there were debates over, who actually wrote the book of Revelation. But not only that, also that it was not considered canon by many early Christians. Like, it was considered kind of inspired, but also flawed. The texts go back and forth between varying church fathers. Even you could go to, some of the more popular ones like Origen, boy, the video we could do on Origen. And when I say Origen, I mean Origen. Origen is one of the most controversial figures within Christianity. Okay. But, even Origen's disciples, would not be so controversial. Characters like Dionysius, who would also say that, yeah, okay, Revelation, like, it's all right, but this isn't scripture. Like, there's something off about this. And I don't think a lot of Christians really realize that. All right. And like I said, while they do accept that there were arguments had, by apostolic councils during the apostolic age, in general, they think that there is this very rote, primitive Christianity, and that's what most Protestants have been trying to achieve for, frankly, centuries at this point, ever since the Protestant Reformation, and honestly, depending upon the group, even before then, considered the Waldensians, among others. And the funny thing is, okay, so, again, you'll get these same Protestants who will recognize, yeah, Gnosticism was a thing, but, that's a later bastardization, just like Catholicism. But I don't think that they really, I almost want to put this diplomatically, but at the same time I don't. Most Protestants don't read their Bible. Now, most Catholics don't either, but then most Catholics don't need to. All right. Like, that's actually like a part of their faith. Like, if you're a Catholic, you're better off actually reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or the compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, than you are actually the Bible. Unless you're reading the Douay-Rheims version, which in that sense, you actually get some time off from purgatory for doing so. How about that deal? So most Christians, I think we can say that safely, really don't read their Bible. They don't understand what's in there. And if they did, they would know this simple fact, that even, and I'm going to be generous to you, that even something that has access to the massive database of information that exists on all of Google's servers, or at least what's allowed to get access by it, that being Gemini Advanced, again, we're not using, this ain't the free version, baby, this is Pro. still got wrong. So I'm going to, in fact, what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to read what Gemini Advanced responded to me with that initial question that I asked, and we'll keep rocking with it. So here we go. So this is the question I asked. What Gnostic groups are mentioned in the New Testament? Gemini Advanced says, quote, no specific Gnostic groups are explicitly named in the New Testament. However, several passages allude to or warn against teachings and practices that resemble later Gnostic ideas. All right, so end quote. I'm going to stop there on Gemini Advanced. So it's half right, okay? As in, yes, there are warnings, okay, of these odd teachings, and you can read it throughout the book of Paul, or the works of Paul, I should say. There's not a book of Paul, but the works of Paul, that, he's constantly, and his works, by the way, are just these very, very casual letters that he's writing to these other churches who are asking him, is this practice right? Is this practice wrong? And he, admonishes them or congratulates them or, basically goes into explanations about how, no, this is right. You should do it this way. No, this is wrong, blah, 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 blah. Okay. And that's fine. Again, everything I've said so far still kind of holds on to this notion that, yeah, sure. Okay. In the apostolic age, there would appear to be like this one Christianity, this primitive Christianity. So far. But there are these warnings of these odd teachings. Again, and we see what the odd teachings are. They're right there in the New Testament itself. And, so that's why I'm saying Gemini Advanced, it's not entirely wrong about this. And it goes on to give examples. Okay, so I'll keep reading here. Quote, some examples include Colossians chapter 2, verse 8, 18, and verse 18 and 19. Warns against hollow and deceptive philosophy and those who delight in false humility and the worship of angels. Whoa. Of course, that's written by Paul. Then 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20, cautions against so-called knowledge that falsely claims to lead to salvation, end quote. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, of course, this is supposedly written by Peter, condemns false teachers who promote destructive heresies and indulge in sensual passions. Oh, Peter has a problem with sensual passions. How about that, Peter? Okay. Then the last example that Gemini Advanced gives is 1 John, and that's different than the Gospel of John, of course. 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 23 identifies antichrists. I love that. Another thing that most Christians don't get. The New Testament constantly talks about antichrists in the plural. There's not just one. But if you believe in the Left Behind series, you just think that there's this one guy coming. Anyway, identifies antichrists who deny that Jesus is the Christ and who reject the Father and the Son. Whoa, bad news. Anyway, okay, Gemini Advanced didn't say whoa, bad news, by the way. But Gemini Advanced reads on, while these passages don't mention Gnosticism by name, they highlight concerns about false teachings that emphasize secret knowledge, reject the physical world, and undermine the authority of Jesus Christ. These concerns align with later critiques of Gnosticism by early church leaders. Okay, so again, what it said, by and large, wasn't wrong. What it did say that was wrong is no specific Gnostic groups are explicitly named in the New Testament. And I responded with, and this usually works, whether you're using ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini Advanced, or take your pick if you're on Hugging Face, whatever. Usually if you ask the LLM, are you sure? You just type that out. Are you sure about what you just typed? And all you have to do is the 3 words. Are you sure? And this is what and that's what I typed out. And Gemini Advanced responds with, yes, I am sure. While the New Testament contains warnings against teachings and practices that resemble later Gnostic ideas, it does not explicitly name any specific Gnostic groups. Gnosticism as a distinct movement developed and flourished primarily in the 2nd century CE after the New Testament was written. So, I then respond, what about the Nicolaitans? This is Gemini Advanced's response. You are absolutely right. I apologize for the oversight. Huh? Don't use this shit for your term papers, folks. Don't count on this stuff ever. Okay, and I actually did test other AI with the same thing, and none of them listed the Nicolaitans as a Gnostic group. However, if you read the church fathers, okay, who are the ones that, understand Gnostics, we don't really know Gnostics so much historically through their own writings. Okay, I mean, we have some of them. We have the Gospel of Thomas. We have the Gospel of Judas. We have some of these things. Okay, but we mainly know them through their detractors. We know them through their enemies. We know them through, again, the early church fathers, the Catholic Church, and so on. So there's usually a lot of embellishment in that, when you're combating against a group, in this case, say the Christian church or the broader Christian church versus Gnostics, who you're combating against usually do a lot of shit talking about, right? And so that's why it's always very tough to, necessarily take at face value or believe even some of the embellishments, or what would appear to be embellishments, by church fathers and varying Christians throughout the ages of what they say about the Gnostics. Okay, so key point to keep in mind. But those church fathers absolutely labeled the Nicolaitans as Gnostics, or at least most of them did. Okay, and I'm going to talk more about the Nicolaitans in a minute. I want to get into that, but because, well, guess what? They're mentioned in the Bible, but or in the New Testament. So let's read the rest of what Gemini Advance had to say. The Nicolaitans are indeed mentioned in the New Testament, specifically in the book of Revelation. They are referenced twice in the letters to the churches in Ephesus and Pergamum, Revelations chapter 2, verse 6 and 15. While the Bible doesn't provide extensive details about their beliefs and practices, it's clear that they were considered heretical by the early Christian church. Their deeds and doctrine are condemned, and they are associated with practices similar to those of Balaam, who encouraged idolatry and sexual immorality among the Israelites. So Balaam, Stallion breaking in, Balaam was, that's a character out of the Tanakh, out of the Old Testament, okay, who, that's exactly what he did, as far as encouraging idolatry, offering food, to idols, which big no-no in the Hebrew faith, and sexual immorality, okay, was also encouraged by him. Now, I'm going to break into that a little bit more. But so far, Gemini Advance, now that it's been caught red-handed, now that it's been proven wrong, is actually getting all of this pretty right. I'll read on. Some early church fathers linked the Nicolaitans to Nicholas, one of the 7 deacons chosen in Acts chapter 6, verse 5. However, this connection remains debated among scholars. That's also true, Stallion breaking in, that not everybody accepts that the Nicolaitans, even though that's their name in the book of Revelation, are in no way related to Nicholas, even though that would seem to be the claim to fame. So going on Gemini Advance, so to revise my previous response, the Nicolaitans are the one specific group mentioned in the New Testament that is associated with later Gnostic tendencies, even though Gnosticism as a distinct movement hadn't fully developed at that time. Okay, so we could say we give, Gemini a pass, right? In that, well, all right, they couldn't really be Gnostics because Gnosticism wasn't some distinct thing until the 2nd century, but when you read the actual people who wrote the history, again, yes, they were competitors and enemies of the Gnostics, but when you read the people who wrote that, or, who wrote about the Nicolaitans, the early church fathers, they considered the Nicolaitans to be Gnostics. Okay, so our very understanding of Gnosticism, it's not like suddenly these Gnostic books came out of the 2nd century. Like I said, they really don't exist. Okay, we only know the stories of like Marcion and all these other guys, again, from their detractors. So Gemini can only know this information from Gnostic detractors. Those same Gnostic detractors called the Nicolaitans Gnostics. So it's still wrong. I mean, we can be a little generous perhaps, but even Gemini Advanced admitted you are, said to me, and I wish it would have called me out by name and said, Dr. Sovryn, you are absolutely right. I love hearing that. Anyway, so who are these Nicolaitans? And I think this is an interesting subject to get into because, again, the very existence of the Nicolaitans in the apostolic age proves that there was no such thing as a cohesive early Christian church, that there is no such thing as a primitive Christianity, because there were debates in Christianity since the beginning. And I don't just mean like the apostolic council, the apostolic council. You've got to understand what gets said in the book of Revelation about the Nicolaitans. It's Jesus saying, he literally uses the word, I hate them, and I hate their practices. That's not some little disagreement between Peter and Paul in the apostolic council. That's Jesus Christ, or whoever's writing the book of Revelation, whoever's being, whether it's John, whatever, or whoever actually wrote it, is laying it out. That's him saying, no, I hate them. Big stuff. No primitive Christianity. Didn't fucking exist. Get it through your head. But let's talk about Nicolaitism for a minute, because I think it's a fascinating subject. And I think they actually get some things right based upon what we know. So I guess we should start off with who exactly are the 7 deacons that, are being talked about here. Yes, during the Apostolic Council, they were appointed, in Acts chapter 6. And we do have exactly 7 of them. This kind of, just like apostolic succession would kind of be a thing, this concept of deacons. Most churches, most denominations, I should say, have the concept of deacons, and usually it's a very important role. Even in Seventh-day Adventism and, some of the, what would be considered perhaps more niche versions of Christianity, still bring in this concept of the deacon. Okay. So the 7 deacons are, of course, Stephen, the protomartyr. Stephen is the one who was stoned, killed. That's why they call him the proto-martyr. Kind of considered the first person to die for the Christian faith. And, he's probably not, but you know what I mean. He's considered that, is written about in the book of Acts. And it was supposedly was actually killed on the order of Paul, who at the time was Saul. There's debate around that, but regardless, Stephen the proto-martyr, okay, Philip the evangelist, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, not related to Pumbaa, Parmenas, and Nicholas being the 7th one. So those are our 7 deacons. And we know a fair amount of a lot of their lives, particularly through the writings of the early church fathers. It's not like, again, Stephen we know about in the book of Acts. Some of these others, we know some of what they did throughout, some mentions, particularly in the book of Acts, but throughout the New Testament. Okay, but this character of Nicholas is the interesting one. And this leads us to talking about, Nicolaitism. And Nicolaitism, so you have a lot of different competing theories of what exactly happened here. Why was there this, and the comparison to Balaam is important, but the insinuation really is that they, at the very least, whether there was something else they were doing or not, at the very least, what the Nicolaitans were doing in the first century as a competing Christian group, what they did was some kind of sexual immorality. Probably the most popular theory, really, would be that Nicholas, okay, yes, there are people who think that it wasn't Nicholas the deacon, that it was another Nicholas that ended up becoming this apostate, sure, okay, but most theories fall in line or fall somewhere within what Epiphanius said, who was the head of the church at Cyrene, or I'm sorry, at Salamis in Cyprus. He was the bishop there in the 4th century. He basically said that it was Nicholas the deacon. And actually, here we go, from his own works. Nicholas had an attractive wife and had refrained from intercourse as though in imitation of those whom he saw to be devoted to God. Okay, Stanley breaking in for a second. The Panarion is, it's the Panarion. The Panarion gets this, this idea that Nicholas would want to emulate those who, are truly devoted to God. This comes right out of the works of Paul, okay, where Paul says, multiple times that, it's my wish that you would never, get into relationships, that you would never get married, and that, that way you could totally devote your life to God, right? So this isn't an unheard of idea. And again, we're talking about, especially in reference to the book of Revelation, we're talking about when you read that, this is clearly, as in Christianity, or the Christianity being espoused there, is clearly an apocalyptic cult, a Jewish apocalyptic cult at that. And there's certainly comments to be made there as well. Okay, but it's an apocalyptic cult in the sense that it's expecting the end of the world to come at any moment. Any moment. Not 2,000 years later. At any moment. Like it could happen in the next second. It could happen while I'm writing the book of Revelation. That's how quickly they were expecting this to happen. Of course, it didn't. And it makes sense for them to expect that. When you read the book of Acts and other parts of the New Testament, it's clearly saying, even though people try to squeeze out different interpretations, but it's clearly saying in a very direct way that you will see the kingdom of Christ come in your lifetime. And that's being said to the apostles. So, I mean, again, you can try and do all of your, all your mental gymnastics you want, okay? So really, as an apocalyptic cult, like the idea of having children, why? I mean, why have them? If everything's just going to end at any given moment, it defeats the purpose. Now, of course, that attitude would change very quickly in Christianity because you'd realize, well, if we don't have more children, eventually you run out of followers, or at least you run out of a natural stock of followers, perhaps. Anyway, so I want to read more from the Panarion, and because I think Epiphanius actually, really comes off potentially as the most honest of the Nicolaitans critics. Okay. So again, he's trying to, so Nicholas stops sleeping with his wife because he's trying to be devoted to God. He's trying to emulate perhaps the apostles. Okay. And then it goes on, Epiphanius goes on, he endured this for a while, but in the end could not bear to control his incontinence. But because he was ashamed of his defeat and suspected that he had been found out, he ventured to say, quote, unless one copulates every day, he cannot have eternal life, end quote. Ooh. Now that might be the most honest and accurate thing I've ever heard a Christian say in my life. I couldn't agree more. All right, I'm done with my victory lap. Yes, so the idea that Nicholas he couldn't handle it anymore. And in fact, Paul talks about this, right? Paul talks about this in the New Testament where he says, I'd rather that you, didn't get married so that you could worship God. But Paul goes on to say that if you can't do that, I understand. And so, yes, go ahead and get married. Basically, he's saying, okay, I get it. Humans have such an insane sex drive. If you can't control it, then by all means, go get married. Okay? So Paul is accepting of sex, despite what some commentators want to say about the Apostle Paul. Regardless, Nicholas seemed to try his hand at the matter, and in not being able to follow in the footsteps of Paul anyway, ends up going the exact opposite direction and says, this quote, again, quote, unless one copulates every day, he cannot have eternal life, end quote. Now, Epiphanius, I think, is the most interesting in talking about Nicholas the deacon because he's the only one that really quotes what Nicholas may have said. Like, what was this difference between the Nicolaitans and other Christian groups, and that really should be plural, we'll get into that, and other Christian groups at the time? This would seem to be the defining doctrine. And it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one for a few reasons, okay? And so it would seem to be that the difference isn't necessarily about offering food up to idols, though I think there's certainly things you can extrapolate from that as well. But more so that this, like, he couldn't control himself and he had to have sex. Now, some commentators go a little bit further than even what, Epiphanius was saying, and would go so far as to say that they actually held their wives in common, meaning that the Nicolaitans were able to sleep with each other's wives whenever they wanted to. they could wife swap, right, on the regular. Okay. Now, a couple of interesting tidbits in all of this. One is, as the Nicolaitans are considered a Gnostic sect, okay, by early church fathers, this clearly shows that Gnosticism is not always anti-sex. Okay. A point which, Robin Freebeard, my longtime co-host, has made, many times over. To say nothing, talking about Valentinus and, so many others. But regardless, that proves that point. So so what we're getting at here, there's not just one Christianity, right? There's no primitive Christianity, but also there's no one Gnostic doctrine. I think most people who understand Gnosticism already knew that, but just to make the point clear, it's made clear here in the New Testament itself, or at the very least it's alluded to within the New Testament itself, particularly in the reference of, the Nicolaitans to the teachings of Balaam. So with this said about the Nicolaitans, we really don't know a whole lot more. There's conjecture, again, and a lot of it is written by the detractors. Like I said, I feel like Epiphanius was being perhaps the most honest. But I want to go a little bit further with this. And in going a little bit further, I also want to talk about other parts of Revelation chapter 2. And particularly, it has to do with the very famous verse that talks about, which is verses 8 and 9 of chapter 2 of the book of Revelation, which has to do with the synagogue of Satan. It actually gets mentioned in chapter 3 as well. But here, I'm going to read the verse quick. Okay, so this is from Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, this verse in particular has been attributed to justification of rampant anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years, and even to today itself. The belief is often that what these verses are saying is that the Jews are a part of the synagogue of Satan. So let's break this down a little bit. One, synagogue is just a Greek word for assembly. That's all that means. Like, it's not, I think Christian writers over the years have capitalized synagogue in this sense. Synagogue of Satan as if it's some kind of organization, but there's no capitalization in the Koine Greek, right? Like, it's just synagogue of Satan. So assembly of Satan. The key here is actually in the language itself. And that is particularly within verse 9, where it says, I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not. Now, part of the problem here, in some ways, I wish historically that the book of Revelation was actually two separate books, but I get why it can't be. Okay, but you have to understand that the very beginning of the book of Revelation, the first, basically up to like chapter 4, okay, and going into chapter 5, are not unlike the works of Paul, where Paul is writing these casual letters to people, to the churches, saying, okay, I know what's going on at your church. You need to be doing X, Y, Z. Okay, you need to be doing this and that. John, the writer of the book of Revelation, who claims to be getting these quotes, or, claims to be getting this information from Jesus himself. And boy, you should read that description of Jesus at the beginning of the book of Revelation. I always find it so funny when you have people who, or you have artists who like draw the second coming of Christ as like he's this very happy guy in this white robe and, white guy, brown beard and all this jazz. No. In the book of Revelation, we know what Jesus looks like at that time, supposedly. And what he looks like is he has like feet of bronze. His eyes are on fire. His hair is white and his beard is white. I mean, this is a scary depiction, but it's being treated more or less as legit. Now, granted, yes, John uses the word sword coming out of his mouth. Okay, in fact, that sword is going to end up getting used against the Nicolaitans. But what that sword is obviously that's not a literal sword. It just means the truth. And the idea of a sword representing truth coming out of, or, a sword out of the mouth representing truth is common well beyond Christianity and very common for, the Greek of the time. Okay, so we get that that's a metaphor, but everything else is being treated absolutely legitimately. And these admonitions to the churches of Asia Minor are also, which is what the first 3 or 4 chapters of the Book of Revelation are also fairly literal. I mean, and there's weird parts about it too. If you do take it that literally, in the sense that, or if you take it at face value, which is how it's meant to be, at face value, like there's the claim that the throne of Satan is actually in Pergamum. Wow. Now, lots of groups will, engage in eschatology that says that these letters to the churches were not literal. They were representative of epochs, of different times throughout history, but that gets into a separate argument of, when did the events of the Book of Revelation happen? Are they all future events, thus making you a futurist interpreter of the Book of Revelation? Were they preterist, which means did they happen at that time in the first century or close to? Or were they historical, as in events that would, basically that did occur, looking at more like real events and everything. You have a lot of different interpretations. I've always felt, that the Eastern Orthodox Church, that their interpretation was the best as far as the Book of Revelation goes. They just come up, they're like, yep, it's scripture, but it's a fucking mystery. We don't know what the hell it means. And like, that's the most honest answer you can have. Kudos to them. Anyway, the beginning, the first 3 chapters or so, of the Book of Revelation, I do think they're meant to be taken very much at face value. So with that in mind, what do we have here? We have in verse 9 where John is saying, I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews, but they are not. So who could he be talking about here? Well, it seems pretty clear, and there's actually a lot more evidence around this. He's talking about Gentiles. He's saying that John, okay, and if you believe it's John the Apostle is saying in 92 CE that Gentile Christians are not Christians. They're the synagogue of Satan. Because if he's being anti-Semitic, that doesn't even make sense. Because what is John the Apostle? He's a Jew. Is he self-hating? Like, what is this? That doesn't make any sense. Jesus was a Jew, and yet here's Jesus coming out and saying that he hates these people? Oh, come on. He's talking about Gentiles, and this gets into a very key thing. Because we know through the book of Acts that one of the very old arguments in Christianity at the time, amongst the apostles, okay, was, do Gentiles have to get circumcised or don't they? Huge argument. Paul seemed to have won the argument that no, they don't have to. Okay, but here in the book of Revelation, and understand, the book of Revelation, minus some of the works of Paul, is really the oldest text that we can date. Meaning, we know some of the works of Paul, at least, maybe all, but at least some of them, we can speak with some certainty. And the book of Revelation are the oldest texts in their entirety in the New Testament. What you're clearly getting throughout the book of Revelation is a different type of Christianity than Pauline Christianity. You're getting a type of Christianity that, because when you read through it, when you read what John is saying, he's talking about living like the priestly cult of the temple. Now, what priestly cult is he talking about? There's been multiple priestly cults for the temple. Okay, and that gets into kind of the conversation around this idea of, what Nicholas the deacon supposedly said, that if you don't copulate every day, you don't get eternal life. So what you really have, okay, is more proof, just from the book of Revelation alone, more proof that, yeah, okay, the Nicolaitans are a different type of Christianity, but what John the Apostle is espousing is also a wildly different type of Christianity than what the Apostle Paul was preaching. Taken at face value, that is so clear It is so clear. Now, the temple's gone at that time, right? But John is trying to carry on the traditions. He's trying to carry on the priesthood, right? I mean, and this is, so much of the language in the book of Revelation is where Jesus or God is saying, I will make you a nation of kings and priests. So the other interesting part of this, because at the time, Christianity really is still, I mean, yes, more Gentiles are coming in. That's why John is writing this. But really, Christianity is still very much a Jewish sect at the time, primarily. Yeah, it's becoming more, and it'll keep becoming more. But at the time, it's still primarily a Jewish sect, and John is trying to keep it a Jewish sect. So the irony is, if you were looking for a primitive Christianity, maybe you were even looking for a Christianity that had nothing to do with Paul, because I know a lot of Christians actually don't like the works of Paul. The most primitive book you have, maybe the book of Mark, if you want to believe that. Okay, or the Gospel of Mark, I should say. If you want to believe that. That's the earliest gospel for sure, but when were the Gospels written? Not in Jesus' time. Maybe they're based on a text that was in Jesus' time, but we don't have that. At least not that we know. The oldest text you've got is the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation says, if you are a Gentile, you're the synagogue of Satan. Point blank. But every Christian, and understandably why, want to completely ignore that. But let's keep going. Let's get weirder. Adding on top of this, why did I say that I actually agreed with, with Nicholas the deacon? Well, it's not just because I love sex, which of course I do, but Nicholas the deacon, the reason I agree with his statement is that that is a statement that actually does come out of Jewish mysticism. And you can read a lot of rabbinic commentators much later on who would actually share who would share that sentiment. Okay, not only that, but we could get into that perhaps there were parts of the oral Torah, not written, that would also suggest as much, and that Nicholas was realizing this and was actually trying, because it's interesting that the one group that gets called out by name as a problem, okay, I mean, yes, we get references to, they're doing this in the church, that's not right, he's sleeping with his mom, he's doing whatever, okay, blah, blah, blah. But, they never get called out by name, except this one. And the reason I think this is basically John the Apostle, okay? He is following a more Pharisee type model of the priesthood, okay? So you had three major groups, at least three. There were more, believe me. And you can read about it, and it's all very fascinating, all right? But John the Apostle, at the time was in a time where there were came out of a time where there were three major competing Jewish groups, that being the Essenes, okay, who may be the Qumran sect, may not be, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees, of course, were ultimately in control of the temple. Granted, the temple was destroyed by the time of the book of Revelation. It had been destroyed for over 20 years. Okay, so nobody had a temple to really control. But, the high priest was a Sadducee. The Pharisees also had priests installed, in the temple, okay, that were part of a, that were kind of a separate priestly cult, even though they work synergistically. And we do have writings that prove that, where like the Pharisees would say, would tell like a Sadducee priest, no, you got that wrong. No, we know how to do it. It's okay. And actually the Sadducee priest would listen and do what the Pharisee suggested. Okay. I mean, Paul, the Apostle Paul, if you believe he was Saul, Saul of Tarsus, if you believe that, he was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, in fact. Okay. So you have, like, it's pretty clear the apostles were bigger on the Pharisees than they were on the Sadducees. Okay, and you get hints of that throughout through a lot of ancient texts, but also throughout the New Testament itself. Okay, so I don't think it's unfair to say that John was trying to push more for sticking to the priestly, because he keeps using that word, as to where Paul drops it, even though supposedly he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He's like, no, I'm done with that. I'm done with the law. I'm done with all this stuff. Okay. John is not, though. And so he keeps going. So John is calling out, really him by saying that, those who claim they're Jews, but they're not, he's really calling out Pauline Christianity in this instance. And he's calling it out for no longer being part of the priestly cult, or particularly the Pharisees cult. Now, the reason I say that it's the Pharisees, because if it was the Sadducees would not have a problem with this sexuality, okay, like that the Nicolaitans may have gone through. Now, we don't know a whole lot about the Sadducees, and just like the Gnostics, we know them mainly through their detractors. The Sadducees is a very similar situation. But there are some not so widely distributed texts and oral traditions, we'll put it that way, that suggest that the Pharisees, of course, granted, like I said, the high priest was, part of the Sadducees, was a Sadducee, that there was actual sexual ritual magic that was done in the temple, and that it had a history of being done all the way back to way before the temple, all the way back to the tabernacle. Okay, and you can read the story of Pinchas to learn about that. That's a big separate subject, but the Old Testament, basically in 1 Samuel, it's made abundantly clear that yes, priests were having sex in the temple. Now, people will say that, yeah, but Pinchas and Hophni, they died, they were killed shortly thereafter, because that was an abomination to have sex in the temple and with the women serving in the temple. But that's not actually the problem. The actual problem was that they were discovered, that they did it, somehow they did it openly, and that was really the issue. But the idea that sex was had in the Holy of Holies, the angels on top of, according to the Talmud, the angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant were wrapped in a loving embrace. They were having sex on the mercy seat. Okay, do you think the priests didn't copy that, and that wasn't like part of the role of of both the male and female servants within there? Oh, absolutely it was. That's a much larger separate subject. But this idea that sex was an aspect of eternal life, if Epiphanius is right, and Nicholas the deacon said that, Nicholas the deacon actually had historicity on his side. Based upon a competing priestly cult, sure, compared to John the Apostle, but he actually, he was not out of place to make such a claim. The idea of holding wives in common and things like this, you've got to understand that it's pretty clear, and it's also clear in the book of Revelation, that the idea that Christians were the true inheritors, especially after the destruction of the temple, okay, in 70 CE, that of the second temple, that they were the inheritors of the priesthood. And so they were going to live like priests. And, you had two separate models, at least at the time. Again, Sadducees and Pharisees. Okay. And so the Christians were somewhat modeling that and making that open. So Nicholas the deacon, and it would make sense that it actually was Nicholas the deacon, because if you are, that you're just under the apostles, who are just under Jesus, right? You're just under the apostles. You have the authority. You have the name cachet. So sure, if you come out and say something as scandalous as, if you don't copulate every day, you don't get eternal life, if you're one of the 7 deacons, people are going to listen to you. And they're going to start practicing and right on. So, ultimately what I've shown here, and the point that I want to get to, is that we have at least 3 Christianities coexisting in the apostolic age. 3. We have the Nicolaitans, we have Pauline Christianity, and we have whatever John the Apostle was trying to espouse in the book of Revelation. And it's not just John the Apostle. He's claiming Jesus was saying this stuff. And of course we prove that, no, the Jews who didn't accept Christ, They are not the synagogue of Satan. The actual synagogue of Satan are the Gentiles who accept Christ, who claim to accept Christ. And I know everybody's going to bring up, something out of Galatians. What is that? Chapter 3, verse 26 or something like that. They're going to bring up Galatians like, oh, he who accepts Christ is already circumcised and is a Jew, and there is neither Jew nor Greek and blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. That's what Paul said. That's not what John the Apostle said. He said the opposite. So this idea of some kind of primitive Christianity, the point of this video is I want to disabuse you of that search. That search does not exist. Is there a primitive Judaism? That's an interesting question. Not really. Okay. I certainly am a, supportive and a practitioner of Kabbalah. And I am, ethnically Jewish. But I would argue that, again, this is why I always tell people, I've talked about this on Patreon content for Sovryn Tech and in other places, that Kabbalah is something that exists, yes, okay, it's passed down through Hebrew writings, it's passed down through Jewish mysticism, it's passed down through Judaism, okay, but it's the seed, okay? Judaism might be part of the tree, but Kabbalah is the seed. And Judaism isn't the only way to practice Kabbalah. So without getting into a conversation about Prisca Theologia, I could certainly do that as well. And it would be an interesting thing to do and may do so in the future, depending upon how this content performs. Look, if you disagree with me on any of this stuff, you go ahead, and I hate saying content, I'm so sorry. But if you disagree with this stuff, you go ahead, you hit those YouTube comments. You tell me all about it, okay? Or if you're on Spotify, you hit those Spotify comments. You tell me all about it. You email me, fu@nwo.red, baby. Let me know. And believe me, I'll cover it. I'm all for it, okay? Feel free, though, of course, to subscribe on any of those venues. Subscribe on YouTube. Getting in the comments, liking the videos, obviously all that stuff helps. Doing similar on Spotify helps as well. And of course, there's Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and so many other ways to access this show. And like I said, with the videos, I do put in video only relevant stuff. So, if you're only on the podcast, I totally get it. I usually just listen to podcasts, even for my favorite YouTube channels out there. But when they make them available anyway, which is part of the reason that I make it available as well. Okay. But the video is definitely the primo way to experience this. So with all of that said, do what Stephen the Deacon said. Go on out there. Make sure you copulate every day to achieve eternal life. And I'll see all of you on the other side. Woo! Woo! Where's Ellen, baby? Woo! Here I come.